Right. I'm here with Dr. Tommy Wood, who is a three-peat guest on this channel. So, all right, Tommy, what are you having for breakfast tomorrow?
I usually eat leftovers for breakfast. So tonight I'm going to grill up some chicken breasts and some veggies, some zucchini I grew in my own garden, and then some peppers and mushrooms. Going to make some skewers. So I'll be eating that again for breakfast.
Oh, nice. That sounds good. This sounds a lot like me too. I usually just eat leftovers. I'm going to have some probably ground chicken and cauliflower rice stir fry with some Bragg's aminos for breakfast. All right. So Tommy, this is one of my favorite people in the world as far as just academic goes. Also just as far as fitness guru guys, just super well versed. But most of his background is in the neuroscience world, and this is going to be really interesting. So, Tommy, what's sort of your background, just briefly, before we get into this awesome new paper you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. So I am an assistant professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington. I've been in various aspects of neuroscience research basically since I was an undergrad. I first did undergrad in biochemistry, then I went to med school, then I did a Ph.D. in physiology and neuroscience. So kind of the past 20 years or so, I've been increasingly interested in various aspects of neuroscience, and I look at that in the lab, and then I also work with different populations, either at risk of or after either traumatic brain injury or, to try and mitigate long-term cognitive decline.
Dang. All right. Well, so with that, okay, there's been a lot of hubbub surrounding Alzheimer's lately, obviously, and neurodegenerative conditions in general. We've seen some interesting stuff coming out, the beta amyloid plaque piece, and just all of that, which we don't necessarily have to go down that rabbit hole and that whole piece, but I want to focus on something, and I'm just going to highlight kind of what you had mentioned to me, and then I'm going to let you dive into this because this is your wheelhouse and something that I'm just here to really learn. It looks like cognitive stimulus and keeping the brain alive by stimulating it might just be one of the most, if not the most important thing.
Yeah, that's certainly what I have come to believe over a period of time. And so there's been this kind of, there's a huge body of supporting literature, but myself and my friend and colleague, Dr. Josh Chirkner, who's a neurologist, we've put together this as what we call the demand-driven theory of age-related cognitive decline, which basically posits that cognitive demand is the most critical factor sort of upstream of long-term cognitive function and or degeneration, depending on the scenario. And in that setting, cognitive demand is this main driver. And throughout the paper, we liken it to exercise, where stimulus is the most important thing to drive muscle growth or adaptation from like cardiovascular function, like from aerobic or resistance training, right? So stimulus is the most important thing there, and it seems to be the case for the brain as well. And then, what we normally look at in Alzheimer's disease is, like you mentioned, amyloid, then hyperphosphorylated tau, these aggregation of these abnormal proteins in the brain. But what it seems is that the amount of proteins that are aggregated, the pathways that go wrong, they're very different from person to person. And that seems to be all driven by, their environment, their genetics, their diet, nutrient status, all those kinds of things. So in order to kind of put it together in this bigger picture, there must be something upstream of that that's driving this process. And then sort of the output differs based on what's sort of happening in the middle, like the environment and nutrient status and genetics and stuff like that. And we believe that cognitive demand is really the important thing there. And you can see this in multiple different arenas. So if you look at protective factors, things that protect against cognitive decline or dementia, early life education is probably the most important thing. So the amount of education you got early in your life is the most important protective factor. There are a number of things that are important to mention when we talk about early life education. So societal factors, inequities, socioeconomic status, obviously all of that comes like baked into the opportunity to get a certain amount of education. And that's not sort of equitable at all in most countries, certainly not the US. So that's an important part that we have to acknowledge. But it seems like the more education you get early on in life, the more protected you are. And then late in life, again, the single most protective factor is ongoing cognitive stimulus. And, you might hear about, like, people might talk about Sudoku or Wordle or brain training or chess playing. That came up in a very nice recent review paper that kind of looks at all these different factors. But the way we see it most commonly is with retirement. So there are multiple studies in multiple countries that basically say the earlier you retire, the earlier you get dementia. And it's because in our modern society, work is the place that we get most of our cognitive stimulus. And so when we retire, we don't replace that with other cognitive stimuli that can take over. And there are a number of things that we know are protective, like music, language, social connection, social interaction, coordinative-based movement, so dance, yoga, things like that. These all seem to be protective, and there's a number of different ways that we can look at that and see it in the research. But when people retire, they don't do those things. They just sit at home and watch TV, again, on average. And we can even, in those studies, you account for things like medical conditions that maybe force you to retire earlier than you would want. And even if you take that into account, it seems that the later you retire, the later you get cognitive decline. So there are a number of different kind of strands that basically suggest that cognitive demand, you're really asking your brain to do cognitively challenging things. And that's not the same as like being busy and multitasking. That's not the kind of cognitive demand that we think is what's necessary to drive new connections, drive plasticity. It's skill-based learning, trying things, failing things. It's that process that really seems to be important. And that is probably we believe is the upstream regulator of then all the things that we then may look at in terms of cognitive decline later in life.
That is wild. So it's like that, even the deep work kind of stuff, the stuff where you're really actually really thinking. And it's interesting because multitasking, I look at, my wife's a stay-at-home mom, and it's multitasking galore, but you would think it's a lot of energy going into the brain, but it's not necessarily stimulating, right? It's more just kind of this chaos, and you're tired from it, but you're not necessarily driving these new neural pathways. Does this happen quickly too? Is this something that's outside of just, hey, this is important for the long term and staving off neurodegenerative conditions? Does it also apply for cognitive performance and building? And how quickly does this potentially happen? Like if you're doing deep work and you're trying to kind of build up this stimuli so that you actually get growth and repair and benefit from it, does it potentially happen quick? I put a link down below for Thrive Market if you're trying to find maybe lower carb snacks or things like that. Figured it'd be helpful to put a link down below. Thrive Market's an online membership-based grocery store. They are a sponsor on this channel, so I throw them a bone whenever I can. So that link is down below. You'll save 30% off your full grocery order. So they have keto snacks, they have paleo snacks, whatever. I don't think snacks are the end of the world. I just think we need to have them at the right place, right? So 30% off your entire grocery order, but also a $50 free gift when you do use that link down below. So if you're looking for different foods that you want to kind of add to your arsenal, you want to just experiment, or you're just looking for a better way to get groceries than going to the grocery store, use them down below. Check that link out.
Yeah, I think both happen. And you can see there's some evidence that like an initial stimulus then translates to better cognitive performance elsewhere. And so it could be if you do something that's kind of challenging from, like a movement, balance-based movement component, then you get sort of like an acute improvement in working memory or executive function. So you get like these acute improvements in function, but then there's also going to be these longer term benefits. And when I think about it, I like to sort of like relate back to how we develop a brain in the first place. And that's my bias because I'm a neonatal neuroscientist by the majority of my training in my day job. And if you think about how a baby builds and wires their brain in the first place, they're learning motor skills, they're learning language skills, they're learning social interaction skills. These are incredibly difficult things to learn that you learn in small, focused periods, followed by rest. Babies sleep a lot. And so anytime they try a new movement, they're going to try it for 10, maybe 20 minutes. They're going to fail a lot. They're going to fall over. They're going to get frustrated. And then they're going to take a nap. And I think this is how these cognitive stimuli really work throughout the entire lifespan. So it's these kind of skills where you're right on the edge of your current capacity, you're challenging yourself to get better, and you could probably only do that for maybe half an hour, and then you need to rest and recover, you need to sleep, right? That's going to be that's where you get plasticity, consolidation, just like with exercise, right? Every good athlete knows that you don't get stronger in the gym, you get stronger when you're recovering afterwards. And the brain seems to be exactly the same. So anything that requires that kind of deep level of focus and concentration, which you can probably only keep up for those short periods of time, followed by a period of recovery, that's the kind of demand that we're thinking about. Whereas there are alternative studies that show high levels of job stress, particularly if it's job stress that you can't control, that's associated with higher levels of cognitive decline. Similarly, high levels of multitasking are associated with lower levels of executive function in some studies. So it seems like this like constant busyness and trying to do multiple things at once, that's almost the opposite. It's not this concerted skill developing effort with periods of recovery. I kind of think about multitasking as like, junk volume, where it's just like making you tired, but doesn't really drive any beneficial adaptation.
Do the benefits cross paths into other skills? So for example, when you're talking about this, I'm talking about learning double unders, right? And it took me, it was everything that you described. It was, I could only practice double unders, the jump rope for, 15, 20 minutes before my brain is just done and I have to stop. Yeah. And then eventually it just clicked, right? Eventually, like, it just got there. And now it's a cakewalk. But this could be just my own brain just thinking about this, but I also noticed that felt like I was more mentally alert. I was able to do things. I was actually able to focus on things better. And it seems to reflect when I do other skill training. So does that translate into other areas of life? Like if someone goes and I'm going to do some skill training and, whatever, maybe they're learning a new skill in the gym and they're doing some different functional movements and they're doing some things that they're learning. Do you see that cross paths into helping them maybe be better at articulating or vocabulary? Does it translate?
So I think yes and no, which is my answer to most questions really. But so if in the short term you've created this environment that's driving some kind of synaptic plasticity or developing new connections, right? And you do that with double unders, and then you go and do some other task. I think there's carryover. You've created this environment that then allows you to better adapt to this other task that you're putting in the short term. There's also evidence that with different types of training, you get carryover to other aspects of cognitive function. So I think that the best evidence is for online brain training. Brain HQ is probably the system that has the best evidence to support its ability to reverse or prevent some aspects of cognitive decline. And it's very abstract, brain type training on your computer. But it's when they then examine people's sort of executive function and more sort of real world scenarios, it seems to translate over. So there is some, if you're training your brain in multiple aspects, there is sort of carryover to cognitive function and other aspects of life, it seems. However, there is some specificity required. So there was one nice study, the SMART study, where they had a four group design, older individuals in their 70s, and they had a resistance training group, they had a cognitive training group, and then they had a control group, and then they had a group that did both. And what they found was that resistance training improved a number of aspects of executive function and cognitive function, and they looked at MRIs and saw a bunch of change. Supposedly beneficial changes on MRI scans. So resistance training, again, sort of like improving cognitive function. So in a separate, a separate domain, and that's sort of like the neuromuscular stimulus then translating over to other domains. However, when looking at things like memory, the cognitive training seemed to add additional benefit. So when looking at things like the hippocampus, there is some specificity in terms of memory training being beneficial for the hippocampus, which is obviously directly related to memory function and is lost or starts to decrease in size or atrophy, particularly as people get into cognitive decline.
Interesting.
And you can also overtrain the hippocampus from a from a memory standpoint. So there's a very nice study where they looked at individuals who learned what we call the knowledge. The knowledge, they probably don't need it anymore. I haven't lived in London for like 10 years. But back in the day, if you wanted to drive a taxi in central London, the sort of standard black cab in central London, if anybody's seen them, in order to be a licensed taxi driver, you had to learn the knowledge. The knowledge is the map of 25,000 streets in a 6-mile radius around Charing Cross Station in downtown London. You basically had to learn the whole map of London so that when somebody got in your taxi and said, I want to go to this street, you should be able to go there without looking at a map. That was required for taxi drivers to work in London. And they did a study where they looked at individuals before and after training for the knowledge. And those who successfully gained the knowledge and passed the exam, their hippocampi grew. They got bigger because of this like intense memory work. So it's stimulus, driving adaptation, driving growth of the part of the brain in adults, which we didn't used to think was possible, specifically for that function. However, they did see some decrements in other aspects of cognitive function because they literally funneled all of their resources into memory. So, I think there is a lot of, so the short answer is there are opportunities for carryover, but when you have to like really focus on one specific skill, you may be drawing resources from other areas. And I think that's kind of, for the average person, a variety of training modalities are going to be best for their long-term health, right? Some resistance training, some aerobic training, balance, power training, all that kind of stuff. But if you want to be a world champion in a specific sport, you're going to, jettison some of those in order to like really become good at that. And so I think this is similar. So there is good carryover unless you're like right at the pointy edge of one specific skill type.
That is wild. So do you find at any point in age, the ability to grow a region of your brain stops? Or does this, because we used to think it only happened in growth, but now, in a child. Okay, but now we see, middle age, does this actually happen in older age adults too? Can you actually grow the brain? Or is there a line at which, just like it's very, very difficult for someone in their 80s to build muscle, is it more difficult for someone in their 80s to grow their hippocampus?
So the area of the brain where you seem to be able to, so the one caveat is that just because like something is getting bigger on an MRI scan doesn't mean there's more cells there necessarily, right? Because there's a whole bunch of like extracellular matrix, all these other proteins that kind of come and support function. So there are some nice studies where people volunteered before they died to get injected with a marker that gets taken up into new cells, something called BRDU. And then, and these are older individuals, a range of adults, range of ages. And then they looked at the brain and they saw that they were still developing new cells in an area of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus. So we know that pretty much adults, regardless of age, can stimulate the production of new neurons, particularly in that area of the brain. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case everywhere in the brain, and we don't have evidence for that. However, we do have evidence that even, individuals in their 70s doing resistance training or cognitive training are seeing structural changes and improvements in the brain that then correlate with improvements in function. So we're kind of told this story that you get one brain and like from the minute you're born, it's just like this continuous decline and there's nothing you can do about it. But that is not true. The adult brain is completely plastic, and there's no time that stops, and there's no time that you can't beneficially adapt to stimuli and then see improvements both in function and structurally, if you're looking at things like MRI scans.
So I guess in essence, you can teach an old dog new tricks. So
absolutely.
I guess the limiting factor, and the question is, does this affect downstream from the brain just with the central nervous system as well? Like, so does this apply just to the brain? Or if someone, let's say they're 80 years old and they're trying to learn, let's just say double unders again, there's obviously a piece of the brain that's attached to, but there's also a physical piece too, right? Does that kind of trickle down? Does someone learn a new physical skill? Is that limited by the physicality, or like, you kind of see where I'm going with this. It's hard to put into words, but where does it stop? Is it purely cerebral, or does it actually affect the rest of the nervous system too, as far as skill training and things like that go?
So, in as much as there is a muscular component, that's going to be, for certain skills like double unders, that's going to be limiting. And we know that as you get older, preferentially you lose type 2 muscle fibers, so fast twitch muscle fibers. So I'm thinking about this particularly for double unders. If you're doing that, you're kind of jumping in spot, However, I think you can, we also know studies looking at individuals in their 70s, you can regain some of that musculature, and you might not be able to gain the same size, but you can certainly gain the same strength, and you can respond in terms of improvements in function with specific training programs. So of course nothing is magic. I can't prevent the aging process entirely, but I think that as long as you have the sort of the peripheral muscular capacity so say again, if we're learning movement based skills, then there will be some carryover, and that peripheral stimulus, like we've looked at studies of individuals, so dancing, yoga, resistance training, it goes both ways. Peripheral neuromuscular stimulus helps the brain, and it seems to work vice versa. So they are connected. So there will be some carryover of benefit, I think.
Can this stimulus be less effective if you're under stress or extreme stress, or if you're relaxed?
So, I mean, with everything, from a performance standpoint, I think the Yerkes-Dodson arousal curve certainly comes into play, right? So some arousal is good and too much is bad. And where you are on that curve will certainly affect your performance in the moment, which then also affects the stimulus that you're generating. So high amounts of stress versus relaxation will probably modulate some of that, but I'm not aware of a scenario where it will have where I'm really worried about that, unless it's not allowing you, because of your state of either relaxation or high amounts of stress, are not allowing you to focus on the task or skill development at hand, which does require like focused work for maybe, like we said, 10 to 30 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I guess it was my thought was if someone came into my yard and said, you are going to die if you don't learn double unders. And, does that change things? Right.
I think that's going to make you more stressed, and you're going to trip over that rope a lot more. That'd be my guess. Yeah.
I hated double. How many times I've got dents in my fence from how many times I threw the rope, and it's just, I thought I was just self-deprecating, calling myself all kinds of names. And my wife's just like, you're in front of, your kids are seeing this right now. Just FYI. It's like, it's stupid temper. But I get how it took me. I'm not very good at double unders, but I spent months trying to get those down. Actually, part of the problem was I was always doing them. At the time, I wore Vibram 5 fingers all the time. So I was picking the rope out from between my toes like every 3 seconds. Oh yeah, I
understand.
And I do it. I usually work out barefoot, so I was doing double unders like barefoot. So I ripped off 2 toenails, basically doing it. So it's just. So Dave Castro is probably laughing right now about this. Okay, I want to. Well, first of all, before we kind of get into this next piece, which is ties in with this, I put a link down below for the study. Just FYI, the way these things work, give Tommy some awesome love by just checking out that paper. Even if you are not super scientifically minded and you just it will help out, because the way these papers work is they do rank a lot, just like YouTube videos rank, the more visibility on them. And papers like this need to get seen because there's just so much noise out there. So I put a link, it's down there in the top line of the description, so you can check it out and check out his paper and give it a thorough read. And even if you just read the abstract just to get an idea of it. I wanted to talk to this thing that we talked about that is widely known with a lot of athletes, but not necessarily widely known otherwise. And that is what is called the central governor theory, or central governor hypothesis. And it's coincides with the brain a lot. And that's just, my embryonic understanding of this is, okay, what happens when you finally reach that level of fatigue? Is it physical, or is your brain really governing this ultimate level? But you probably can give a much better explanation of this.
Yes. So the idea, and I believe largely, if not originally posited, certainly popularized by Tim Noakes in the endurance community, is that essentially there's this unconscious component of the brain, some central regulator, and there's probably a number of regulating processes, in and around the hypothalamus that look at energy availability, that look at temperature, other things, neuromuscular fatigue. There's going to be some kind of sort of signal coming in there that essentially feed back, and in its simplest form says, what you're doing right now is beyond, you don't have the capacity to continue that. So it shuts down any further, or it dampens down the ability to put in additional effort in order to either, keep your body safe and or, regulate energy availability, or, make sure that there's some still around for things like the brain and the immune system, like we've talked about before. And it relates to mainly acute performance. So I remember this. We weren't talking about the central governor hypothesis at the time, but I remember when I was an undergrad and I was rowing. We were doing, I think it was a 5K test we were doing on the row at that time, and like we're all going, and I mean it's. 5K and 2K tests on the row are like some of the most painful things that I think that people can subject themselves to. And you're sort of like maybe 2/3 of the way through and the coach is yelling, you're not actually as tired as you think you are. Like if you stopped rowing, or if you gave up entirely, or you thought you couldn't row another stroke, like we could stimulate your muscles and they'd continue to contract. Like basically saying that your head can override a lot of this. And this is certainly the case. And there's this bit of this attritional training that we do in some aspects of sports is basically just telling your brain, do you know what, I can do this and I can survive. And the central governor hypothesis would say that you're essentially training that governor to say that you can work at that level of intensity or pain or suffering, and actually, do you know what, it's okay, you survive, you do all right. And then by doing that, obviously you're getting some physiologic adaptation, but there's also this sort of central resetting of like, what is the limit of your capacity? And then that will then prevent you from, sort of giving up when it gets too hard, or, down regulating your ability to contract your muscles or whatever, as your sort of intensity increases.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And I used to have this kinesthetic awareness thing where I would have this switch that I would flip in my head, right? It would literally, like, I could visualize it and I'd flip this switch when I would get to a certain point in pain. And that was like, I could squeeze another 5 or 10% out of it, just out of that visualization. And I think for a long time, and then it sort of raised my threshold, my new line of resistance, so to speak, was seemingly higher. And then interesting, I would argue that that governor can also turn down too. I mean, if you go through a period of time, after having my first kid, my son, my training took a little bit of a nosedive. I still trained, but it turned into just maintaining, right? I wasn't sleeping well, had a newborn, something very new to me. It took me a while to build that resilience back up. And it wasn't purely because my strength maintained the same, right? My strength was the same, but my level of resilience seemed lower, my mental motor, so to speak. And I can't remember the paper, but it was done, I think, with PJs, with Air Force PJs. And they were looking at like when they're sleep deprived, they could default to sort of that lowest level of training. And that kind of ties in with this, I think, and especially because you and I both work with special forces and we kind of see this. It's like maybe you can train that baseline, right? That level of that resistance line. And one would argue, okay, well, then if someone is a military operator, then that means that they're going to always be tough even when they're 70 or 80. I would say that that's not necessarily the case. Like you could lose that. Now, this is purely hypothetical, but what's your take on that? Do you agree or?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as with anything, your physiology adapts over time, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. So if you I think you can probably detrain, if the central governor exists, and again, it's still a hypothesis because there's no really good way to test that. It makes sense in a number of ways, but you can, if you can train it, then it will also detrain just like any other part of the brain or body. And where it's interesting, and I found it very relevant recently, Tim Noakes again actually wrote a paper suggesting that the central governor was a part of long-term recovery from chronic fatigue states. And again, so now chronic fatigue being often a post-viral state, very common, very important in long potentially. And so what happens is people very rapidly realize that their capacity is no longer what it was previously. And the majority of the people that I've worked with long have been high volume endurance athletes. So they're used to pushing their bodies very hard, and they just find they can no longer do that. And part of the idea is that if you expect that you can do what you could do before, you'll try and put in those efforts, and you're essentially asking too much, like more than your brain wants to give you. And then that drives a further spiral of fatigue. But so what you have to do is like very slowly retrain it over time. So imagine that, you allow your capacity to be down where it is, and you sort of consistently do a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. So even when you're fatigued, you make sure you do a little bit, but when you feel good, you don't do too much. And then over time, you can sort of retrain the system. And there's some interesting work by guys like Bob Navio, where he looked at the metabolic state of individuals with chronic fatigue, and it basically looks like the switch has been turned down. He calls it it looks like a hypometabolic state. So something centrally is like just turn down the signal, and it's, the hypothesis is that you're trying to protect the body. You've undergone this significant insult, and now you don't want to push the system too hard because you're worried that you're unable to handle it. So part of the way that we could overcome that is just again with sort of like smaller like pushing against the limits and developing capacity over time. But it's difficult for people if they've lost a huge amount of capacity. If you have an identity as an athlete, that's like part of who you are, and not being able to do that is a difficult part as well. So then that cognitive aspect becomes something that you have to deal with too.
Very interesting. Yeah, because you're not going to be able, especially when you're seeking your validation from how much can I perform and how well can I perform. And when that is attenuated so much, and you feel like, okay, well, I deserve to be here because I was here. That's really, really interesting. So I think this is a great transition, because I want to be able to end on something that's really positive here either way. Being able to sort of think yourself into something working, like sort of the placebo nocebo effect, but even that on steroids. Really, you look at like fake sugar beverages, things like that, like that can actually give you sort of this effect of I've got more energy. Or if you sincerely believe that training in a fasted state is providing you more benefit. Now, can you, well, first of all, we'll explain what that means, but also the second question with that, can you train your body? Can you train your brain to believe something? Or do you have to, from inception, sort of believe that to be the case? So what I mean by that is if someone learns and they grow up thinking that training fasted is better, and then they learn that maybe training fed might be better, but they're apprehensive about it, can they train themselves to think that, or does it kind of come with what's sort of innately built in, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. One of the most interesting things to me, particularly in those trying to optimize, which is a word that I've stopped using pretty much for this reason, like those trying to optimize their health, the expectations drive so much, like the cognitive aspect drives your physiology, change your physiologic responses to a number of different things. So to kind of give some context, there was this great study where they took individuals and then they randomized them. So they put them on a treadmill test. They randomized them to tell them You have like good aerobic performance genetics, or you have bad aerobics performance genetics. And those who were told that they had bad genetics, quote unquote, this bad SNP for aerobic performance, they got worse on the treadmill the next time, regardless of what their actual genetics were. And similarly, they did the same thing with the FTO gene, so the fat mass and obesity associated protein. And by randomizing people to tell them that they had this gene, this SNP or not in this gene, it actually changed their satiety and increase in responses to food. Like you can measure the hormones and they were different based on what you were told, regardless of your actual genetics. So these like expectations change physiology. And related to that, there are some nice studies where if you look at individuals and this was in NHANES, and they gave them pedometers. So you can measure how much activity they're doing, and you can measure, then you ask them how much activity they're doing. They do both. And then you say, how much activity do you think you're doing compared to other people like you? And what they found was that after you adjust for like all the health conditions they had, the amount of exercise they actually do, if you think you do more exercise than other people, they lived longer. The people who said, like after adjusting for how much exercise they actually did. So where this is important is where we think we're not sleeping enough, we're not exercising enough, we're not working hard enough on our diet. Regardless of whether that's true or not, you're creating this negative psychological environment that we know can negatively affect your health and performance. So we see it in this optimization sphere. I think it can have this sort of like negative effect, but there's also ways we can hack around it, right? So if you acknowledge that whatever it is you're doing is great, I'm probably eating better, sleeping better, and moving more than the vast majority of the population. Like I'm doing all this great stuff, and that's going to do me good. You're probably going to see benefit from that. However, the last bit of your question really was, so like what happens if like things change, or does it have to be like baked in? I think there's probably like shades of gray here. Like if you look at the placebo effect, patients get a greater placebo effect if the doctor believes that the thing that they're giving is going to be beneficial, right? So you can like feel, so if the doctor knows it's a placebo, you get less of a benefit than if the doctor thinks it's a real thing that's going to help you. However, you would still get a placebo even if the doctor knows it's a placebo. The next level is that you will still get a placebo effect even if you know it's a placebo. So they've done studies where they give you a bottle, like this is a placebo. It says on the bottle, you take the pill, and I think they've done this with blood pressure and maybe some mental health symptoms, and you still see benefit. You know it's a placebo, but you're still taking it and you're still getting benefit. So you can sort of learn your way around it, and kind of if you create that environment, even if you know you're getting a placebo effect, that placebo effect can still be beneficial for you.
Maybe it's just because you're deeply rooted as a cynical person and you're trying to throw off the system. Like, I know I'm getting a placebo, I'm going to mess with this. That's pretty, that's wild though. I definitely didn't know that. Yeah. I try to train in different states, right? I try to train deeply fasted. I try to train in a ketogenic state. I try to train in a glycogen depleted state. I try to train in a highly fed state. And I try to train throughout all these different continuums and all these different methods and different ways that I'm fueled with exogenous ketones, without exogenous, to try to really find. And ultimately, I find that I tend to perform about the same across the board, probably because that's how my mindset is set up. I'm like, okay, well, maybe one isn't necessarily better. But if I'm really like interested in the science in one particular area, I start to see improvements in that area. And it's probably just because that's how I'm wired and I get interested in that. And you said something that was so interesting to me. You were like, I think it was in regards to training deep in a fast and doing heavy lifts when I'm fasted. And I said, I just feel like I'm better. And then by all means, you absolutely should. Because you're going to get more benefit out of it that way. And it's like this weird caveat between some of the weird misinformation and crap that's out there. It's like sometimes giving people a little brick in the wall, a little nuancy, mechanistic. Sometimes that is what they need to like convince themselves, as long as you're not lying to people and giving them the wrong thing, but like being able to explain a mechanism as long as the proper disclaimers are there, being like, this is mechanistic, this is not observed, this is what's potentially happening. I find with that education, sometimes that gives a little spark of motivation that people need to get the benefit that they're looking for, and arming themselves with potential knowledge, right? But the caveat is the disclaimer needs to be there that this is not vetted out, right? This is just what we're starting to see. And it just makes so much sense, because I think there's a subset of people that are their mind works in these ways where they like to know how systems and processes work. And when they do, or when they have an understanding of this is potentially what's happening, it helps them perform better. It's so wild, man. I mean, the more that I learn, the less that I know, and realize I just resign a lot of it to the brain.
Yeah, I think the more that we can get, knowing these things, I think is great, particularly if it's going to benefit our health. Like, you may be, if you're the person and you think that exercising, going deep into a fast and exercising, you're maximally upregulating autophagy, this is going to be maximum benefit. I have no idea if that's true or not, but believing it, I think, will provide additional benefit. And like, you're right that the things that you would recommend, dietary, lifestyle, movement, exercise, sleep, we don't even know how they work, right? I feel like every month there's a new paper in Science or Nature that says, hey, when you exercise, you make this weird molecule, and then when we take that molecule and we inject it into mice, they live longer, right? This has happened every month for years. Irisin, MOTS-c, we just had that phenylalanine lactate molecule just came out, right? So we're still learning how exercise, like what exercise does. I mean, I know it's beneficial, right? But I don't even know how it works half the time, right? So like, this is how these things are. And I've kind of come back, I've obviously spent a lot of time sort of like deep in the biohacking, and then just like realized I have no idea if this is what is going on. However, I'm pretty certain that I can recommend these things and you're going to benefit from them. Yeah. So I'm still feel pretty safe in that. Whether that mechanism is happening, I don't really know.
Well, and I think that's the beauty of sort of the biohacking world, is that the people that are doing it properly and explaining it properly, there's a few, I'm not going to say names, but it's when biohacking allows you to, just in the very term of it, you're just implying that this is all just testing on yourself and experimenting on yourself. And I think sometimes we live in such a PC world where people are afraid to make claims, and they should be. Like, you shouldn't just go out and make like ruthless scientific claims that you know nothing about. But again, as long as you are understanding, like, I'm going to test this on myself, and if it works for you, it works for you. And actually, who really cares what ends up happening, right? It's like, if it works for you, and the level of bio-individuality that we have between all of us, it just doesn't, like, it may work for you and it may not work for me. And we probably will never know why. And I feel like it comes right back to the brain and motivations too. And just like, what drives that? Because for me, doing what I do online, doing this actually continues to motivate me, because it gives me a reason to do what I do outside of just my own health and my family, right? So it can take the wind out of your sails if you let it take the wind out of your sails, right? Because it can be like, I just give up. I don't want to do this anymore. But if you continue to realize like the progression that you make by learning and just continuing to just be the best version of yourself, as cheesy as that sounds, there's a benefit there.
Yeah, and what's great about that is all this stuff, all this learning, the new pathways crop up, realizing you're wrong, doing something else. This comes right back to what we were talking at the beginning of this conversation, which is, those are beneficial cognitive stimuli, like actively learning, engaging, being wrong, acknowledging you're wrong, failing, like all of that stuff's super important. So yeah, embrace it. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, totally, man. Well, Tommy, as always, man, thank you for hopping on, and probably going to do some more together. And if you haven't checked out the other videos that we did together, I'll link them down below in the description, and they'll probably pop up recommended on YouTube as well. But Tommy, thank you very much, man. And I'll link out to your Instagram and everything down below, but also check out his paper as well.
Cool. Thanks so much. This was awesome.